All right, we're ready.
So thank you, Michelle High, Senior Editor, American Purpose. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. It is a pleasure and an honor to have with us today Elliot Ackerman. You know him as probably as a friend in some of your cases, but as a New York Times columnist, as a best-selling author, as a novelist, a former White House fellow. Elliot served and actually did 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. He lives in New York and Washington, D.C. He's just back from Ukraine, actually, and he was there and in Poland this summer, too. We're going to talk to Elliot about his latest book called The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan. If you don't have it yet, get it. Read it. Penguin 2022. We've just passed an important anniversary, 9/11. We've just passed a year since what I would call, at a minimum, the very difficult, I'll let Elliot speak to that, the difficult American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Elliot, I like the book for a number of reasons. You're a great writer, you're a great storyteller, you tap into important experience, but I have to say a book like this struck me not only because it shares and it analyzes, but it brings to the fore things that I think we often overlook on a subject like this. And those are things like empathy and service and gratitude. And I love the book. Welcome, Elliot. I'm going to ask you a few questions to get us going. You take the conversation any which way you wish. And then after 20 minutes or so, we're going to bring in the gallery for questions and comments. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to Elliot. And Elliot, I'm going to ask if you could, for the benefit also of those who have not yet read the book, talk to us a little bit about how you organize this work. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5, the convoy of 109 to start. Give us a little sense of the structure and the arc and where you're taking the reader.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Jeff, for hosting me, and great to be with everyone here at American Purpose. So the title of the book is The Fifth Act, which obviously alludes to the structure of the book. The idea for that structure came about is as Kabul was falling a little more than a year ago, a friend of mine who has a pretty successful Substack, she reached out to me and she was sort of gathering a series of essays, 500 words as she put it to me. And I frankly didn't really want to write. I was having a hard time processing what I was seeing on television. And when I asked her, I said, kind of what would you like me to put in this essay? She said, well, people haven't really been paying attention to Afghanistan for a long time, and they're having a hard time understanding what they're seeing. So maybe you could explain, what's gone on the past 20 years. And I sort of laughed and said, how can you summarize a 20-year war in 500 words? And her response to that was, well, people, they're watching this happen and they just know that it's a tragedy. And it was that word tragedy really just stuck with me. And, because if you look in classic dramatic structures from Shakespeare to the ancients, typically tragedies are told in 5 acts. And that kind of gave me the idea of a scaffold to summarize the war, which is the first act being the presidency of President Bush, then Obama, then Trump, then Biden, and the 5th act being the Taliban. And in the book, the book talks and it goes into great length, sort of the different administrations and some of the challenges that they faced and their philosophies on the war as part of this 5-act structure, culminating with sort of the denouement being the Taliban coming into power. But then that summer, like so many people who served in Afghanistan or were journalists there or activists there, I got sucked into, what many have called this digital Dunkirk, this crowdsourced effort to evacuate people primarily from mid-August until the end of the month. And I was involved particularly, with really 5 5 evacuations, and I wanted to tell the story of those 5 evacuations, and they had different outcomes. So it's the story of these presidencies. It's the story of these 5 evacuations, and I would say sort of the last underpinning of the book, the way it's structured, is through all of this, as we were trying to get people out of Afghanistan, the subtext was thematically was what does it mean to leave no one behind? Because we're trying to exit with grace, with honor, which means we're trying not to leave our allies behind. That's why we're doing this evacuation. And that idea of that idea of adhering to a code of we don't leave anyone behind, it's something that in the US military is pumped into you in training from day one, but it's not specific to the US military. I mean, it's really an idea that's as old as war. And if you go all the way back, Homer, and you read the Iliad, in the Iliad, after Achilles kills Hector, he drags Hector's body back to his camp. And one of the final scenes of the Iliad is Priam, king of the Trojans, going into Achilles' camp to beg for the body of his slain son, to, in effect, live up to that code of not leaving anyone behind. So this is a very old idea. And I wanted to write about a time in my own life when I was fighting in Afghanistan in 2008 with the Marines, when my unit was caught in an ambush and one of my comrades was killed, and a time when I wondered whether or not I lived up to that code of leaving no one behind. Because as events were taking place in Afghanistan, I found myself psychologically, I've returned back. I kept returning back to that episode. And I think for many, particularly veterans who fought in the war, it was important to include my experience of being sort of sucked back in time, because for many of us, we built lives away from the war. For me, I left the war in 2011, and now this was all happening in 2021, so 10 years later. But it was as though the war had reasserted itself in my present life in an extremely powerful way, with the way that the evacuation was happening and the way the war was ending. So the book sort of toggles around. On the one hand, it's a book that gets into policy issues, at the level of these different presidential administrations. At another level, it's a book that deals with the immediacy of the evacuation. And then at the last level, it's a book that I think is a bit of a meditation about what it means to finish a war, what it means to leave no one behind, and to kind of make good on these higher moral claims and the morality of war in general. So that's sort of the structure of the book. It toggles around quite a bit.
Elliot, thank you. That's enormously helpful. Let me ask you a 2-part question, part and parcel of the same area. One about the withdrawal, and you described the botched withdrawal as a administrative failure that led to a humanitarian catastrophe. The first part of my question is, talk to us a little bit about how a very competent United States botched this so badly. It's rather mind-boggling. And then the second part of that has to do with a little more broadly, how we as Americans allowed this to happen when we did have allies who assisted us over years courageously, and in many cases were left so vulnerably. There are 2 sides of the same coin, in my view. If you all see over my shoulder, I don't know if you can see it, I've got a photograph on my wall of 2 young Afghan kids. I'm a former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, called Radio Azadi, the most popular station in the country. So much dependency from cross-section of society. And I know in our case, I'm a board member now, no longer an executive there, we left people behind. I mean, we simply did not get all the journalists, all the stringers, all the families out who wanted, needed, and deserved to get out. So how did we botch it? And how do we reflect and learn on the right and wrong way to withdraw?
Well, it depends on where you want to start the conversation. So, there's a conversation about whether taking US troop levels to 0 was the right decision. And then there's a conversation about once that decision was made, how it should have been implemented. I'll try to speak just a little bit to both. I think when we talk about whether or not that decision should have been made and we should have taken U.S. troop levels to zero, it begs a conversation of why are we taking U.S. troop levels to zero? We were doing that to, quote, end a war. Well, I would offer the observation that wars don't just end. Wars end in one of three ways. Wars are either won, they're lost, or they are postponed. And in the case of Afghanistan, it was a war that was clearly lost. But this idea of taking troop numbers down to zero is how we end the war is sort of fallacious. Look, if you look at the history of American wars, we have, for instance, after the Second World War, left many troops behind in the wake of winning that war. There's still, 40,000 plus troops in Europe, tens of thousands of troops in the South Pacific from the Second World War. The Korean War, we still have a troop presence of about 30,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula. Indeed, the only time that troop levels come to zero at the end of a war is the wars that we've lost, for instance, the Vietnam War. So this idea, I think, in the United States that we conflate ending a war with U.S. troop levels at zero is sort of a false equivalence. It's a false story we're telling ourselves about war. The only time the troops, again, they come to zero is when we lose. And after the withdrawal, about a year ago at UNGA, Joe Biden made statements, and he made a statement in which he said, for the first time in 20 years, America is not at war. And that's a pretty misleading statement because in places like Iraq, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and others, U.S. troops in Syria, U.S. troops still draw imminent danger pay. So are those troops not at war? And if you look at the levels of violence in Afghanistan before our withdrawal, and even in the 2 years prior to our withdrawal, actually, we had gotten levels of violence to U.S. troops extremely low. In the year before we withdrew, more troops were killed at Camp Pendleton alone than were killed in all of Afghanistan. The number's 4. And if we look at the troop size in Afghanistan, we were basically 90% withdrawal. When I served at Afghanistan at the height of the surge, there were 150,000 troops in Afghanistan. That number was down to about 15,000 before we began our final withdrawal. So I think there are a lot of questions about whether or not this was the right strategy. I would argue that it wasn't, and I'm sure everyone here has seen that debated as of late in the news. But once that decision was made, there's the question of how we implemented the decision. And I'm sympathetic to the Biden administration's position in so much as once they announced a date certain for our withdrawal, the gamble and what everything was bet on was that there would be a decent interval between our withdrawal and the final endgame between the Afghan government and the Taliban. The place where I see a great deal of negligence was that's hopeful thinking. There'll be a decent interval, maybe it'll be a year, 2 years, maybe even 6 months. But there was no contingency planning for what if there wasn't a decent interval. And that became very clear as Kabul airport fell. And to me, that's where the negligence exists. As policymakers need to always be planning for the worst case scenario. And this was a very obvious worst case scenario. Indeed, if you look in May and June, there was a letter sent by a bipartisan group of Congress members to the White House warning about such a scenario, asking for contingency plans for flights to Guam, for instance, asking for the SIV process to be sped up, and the White House didn't respond. It was a very active decision not to plan for this worst case scenario, and the result was ultimately what we saw at the end of August at the airport.
Elliot, thank you. Could you tell us a little bit, take us back to last summer, last August? You're no longer in the military, you're a veteran. The transition and withdrawal begins, and you became involved with friends and others in arranging flights, evacuating people, negotiating with the Taliban. How did this actually come about?
It began initially with colleagues of mine who are journalists. And I had a couple of Afghans who I'd served with who are now in the United States, but their families were still in Afghanistan, and they needed help and reached out to me. And colleagues of mine who are journalists were also working to get people out, some of whom were on the ground in Afghanistan. And so sort of very clearly the scope of what we needed to do became obvious. And as I said, we began just sort of crowdsourcing the tasks that needed to take place. Everything from organizing buses to bus people from places like the Serena Hotel to the airport, to making the lists of who would be manifested on these buses, to raising funds for private flights to come in. One colleague of mine who had written a book about the Taliban and had very good connections within the Taliban itself began negotiating with the Talibs in Kabul to get them through the various checkpoints. And, the value I was able to add was I still have many, contacts, old comrades of mine in the US military and in our intelligence agencies who were either at the airfield or in administrative control of forces that were at the airfield. So I began coordinating with them to just try to get people through the gates. So very quickly, sort of a team of about a half dozen of us kind of came together to try to start getting convoys into the airport. And that was sort of how this began.
So thank you. I will say parenthetically, Michelle is dropping some things into chat. Of course, first and foremost, Elliot's book, The Fifth Act, Americans in Afghanistan. We published a number of things. In particular, let me draw to your attention the piece by Dan Schro, who's with us today, a painful piece on how America leaves and sometimes leaves allies behind. Elliot, I have one last question. I'm going to transition a little bit just to widen the lens. We are not fighting a war in Ukraine, but I would suggest we're fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. It's my own view that the stakes are bigger than merely Ukraine and the region, that there's a lot at stake. And I know you've been to Ukraine twice, even last weekend. Could you move a little bit away from the subject of the books, widen the lens, talk to us about your trip and what the promise and peril is as America engages in this crisis and war? I would take your word that we always plan for the worst and think about contingencies. Where are we? How should we think about this? And where do you see the opportunities and dangers?
Well, I think it's critically important to widen the lens, and I fear in the strategic thinking around Afghanistan, we failed to do just that. The administration made the point on several occasions, and I wholeheartedly agree with them, that the United States is at a point where it needs to focus less acutely on counterterrorism and re-emerge into the game of great power competition. And I think that is absolutely appropriate. Where I think our thinking has become muddled is Afghanistan is looped into that great power competition. So you can drop a plumb line from the events of August 2021, which I would argue are probably NATO's darkest hour, a debacle at the airport that the entire world saw. And you can drop a plumb line from those events to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Now, I wouldn't argue that it was 100% causative, but certainly as Putin was weighing whether or not to make a move inside Ukraine, one of the factors he was considering was what type of NATO response he would be met with. And the images coming out of Afghanistan were certainly encouraging that he would not meet a full-throated NATO response. And I would argue it's been dizzying that in those 6 months from August 2021 to February of 2022, we see both what I would argue is one of NATO's darkest hours, followed by one of its highest moments, which is the way it overperforms after Russia invades Ukraine. And so as Russia rolls into Ukraine, it's certainly worth asking, why does Ukraine matter? And I would posit that one of the reasons Ukraine matters so much is the world is facing a rise of authoritarian regimes from a more assertive Russia, a more assertive Iran, and certainly a more assertive China. Had Russia steamrolled through Ukraine, the next obvious question would be, what does this mean with regards to China and Taiwan? And I think we're still asking those questions as we watch events unfold in Ukraine. And so when we think about a Chinese incursion into Taiwan, one of the great challenges we have when trying to respond as the West and as Americans is obviously China would be fighting that fight in their backyard, whereas we would be trying to fight it all the way across the Pacific Ocean. And wouldn't it be nice if, when considering a potential US involvement in Taiwan, if we had, say, strategic air bases in a Central Asian country like Afghanistan that shared, albeit a very small border, a border nonetheless with China. And we forfeited that presence last year. So this is all interconnected. Just to be a little bit specific about Ukraine and what's going on there right now, I think we're seeing, a pretty remarkable counteroffensive that is taking back large swaths of terrain in Ukraine. One of the things that's always struck me since the Russian invasion, when I've been in Ukraine is, and because we're talking about how wars end, when you talk to Ukrainians about the end of the war, they will never say the end of the war. They say the victory, until the victory, after the victory. They always refer to it as a victory, as though they have this bone deep understanding, as I mentioned, that wars end one of three ways: victory, loss, or postponement. But I think what Ukrainians are going to need to become more clear about, and what their leadership and President Zelensky will need to become more clear about, is what does the victory mean? Does the victory mean Russia is rolled back to its pre-February 24th borders? Or does the victory mean that Russia is rolled back to where it was pre-2014? And that is going to be a politically probably complex issue for Ukrainians to answer for themselves, and one fraught with a lot of peril, because oftentimes militarily our points of maximum success are often our points of maximum peril. Historical examples I would point to would be, for instance, MacArthur after the Incheon landings in Korea, where he decides to head towards the Yalu River and finds himself encircled, or even after the Persian Gulf War, when we're very successful pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and H.W. Bush makes the very wise decision not to go further into Iraq. If Ukrainian successes continue, they might find themselves confronted with such a decision, and they're going to need to answer the question of how far do they want to go and how much risk do they want to assume if potentially overextending themselves with regards to Russia.
Good, Elliot, thank you. I have more, but I'm going to hold my peace for this moment. Let's open it up to the gallery. Dan True, I'm going to call on you first. If you're able, you all press the raised hand function when I don't see it. Michelle is good at seeing many things that I don't see and alerting me. But first things first, and Dan True, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I have a general question, which perhaps you can answer. In Vietnam, in South Vietnam, we had a lot of supporters, actually. It wasn't just a puppet government, but it was an inept government. In Afghanistan, of course, as you point out, we had a lot of supporters. It's doubtful that the majority of Afghans really want Taliban rule. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein really was hated. So how come the United States winds up supporting inept and corrupt governments and making them allies who then throw away potentially promising situations?
Well, thanks for that question, Dan. I feel like that's sort of the question of the age, isn't it? And if I had a simple, tidy, and convincing answer, we might not be sitting here, candidly. There are obviously a lot of echoes between Afghanistan and Vietnam. I think, and this might not be a direct answer to your question, because I'm struggling with a simple answer to that. But I always felt that in Afghanistan, one of the things where there was an echo in Vietnam is we didn't understand our adversary entirely, and we thought the war was about one thing when in many ways it was about something else. And our misapprehension maybe caused us to not understand who we were working with. So the parallel I would draw with Vietnam is, in Vietnam, so much of the conversation around the war in the United States was domino theory, stopping transnational communism, when in retrospect, we look at that war and understand that for the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, it was a war of national liberation. I would argue that one of the similar mistakes we made in Afghanistan was, we go into Afghanistan with this counterterrorism mission. We were going to stop Al-Qaeda and the Taliban very early on. There's years where they're just, I think in the American psyche, they're conflated. It seemed like there was very little distance between the objectives of the Taliban and the objectives of Al-Qaeda. think we know in retrospect, they are two different organizations, although they often have helped one another. And that on the one hand, the war in Afghanistan, yes, was about, in some respects, fighting transnational Islamic terrorism. But for many Afghans and the Taliban, it was a war of national liberation. And because we didn't focus acutely on that, we didn't understand what an enormous liability having a dysfunctional and corrupt Afghan government was. It wasn't something we could sort of slide to the side. It became a critical strategic vulnerability for us, and ultimately led to the Taliban having more sway than they necessarily should have. But after 20 years of war, I think there are many, should have, could haves, and would haves, going all the way back to 2002 and 2003, the distraction that the Iraq war became in Afghanistan, our inability to, in some ways, co-opt elements of the Taliban into the Afghan government so that those same elements were brought back into Afghanistan as part of a Pakistani-based insurgency in 2005 and 2006. I mean, there are all of these moments where I think strategically we sort of blew it. And I would say one of the reasons we blew it is I think we didn't understand early on that the Taliban objectives were substantively different than Al-Qaeda's objectives, even if the two were allied. And maybe there's a similar reason in Vietnam. But I don't think there is a tidy answer there. I think it's something we've really struggled with as a country in these types of wars.
Thank you.
Dan, thank you. Elliot, thank you. Michelle, I'm looking for a next hand. Do you see someone I'm overlooking? While you are waiting and gathering your thoughts, I'm going to ask you a question, follow on and not unrelated to Ukraine. Elliot, while you were in Ukraine the last few days, I was in Berlin. I experienced in Berlin, among elites across the spectrum, tremendous support for Ukraine. However, a quarrel with your thesis that wars have a winner, a loser, or a postponement. And what I heard frequently in Berlin last week was this war will end with a peace process at a negotiating table that will, however unappealing the prospect, include Vladimir Putin. Could you comment on that, I think, why you would say that will constitute a postponement and we'll have seeds of the next round of conflict? But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want you to interpret that for us.
No, you're certainly not putting words in my mouth. I think that is the equivalent of what could potentially be a postponement, and is part of a conversation that is being forestalled inside of Ukraine right now, which is, in the event that Russia does not achieve its objectives in Ukraine, what are Ukrainians willing to accept? Are they willing to accept a Russian occupation of the Crimea? Are they willing to accept that Ukraine's borders won't return to the pre-February 24th borders? I mean, that is sort of the question. I think much of that will be hashed out at the negotiating table, if that's where the war leads, and will be dictated by what degree of military gains the Ukrainians are able to make against the Russians. I think the other important variable here that needs to be weighed is so much of the war in Ukraine has been prosecuted thus far with the assumption among Ukrainians and NATO member countries that Vladimir Putin needs to keep this war categorized as a special military operation, and that he does not have the political ability to to engage in a national mobilization of Russia, to get the troops he would really need to bring the full force of Russian might to bear. And I would just point out that's potentially a dangerous assumption, particularly if Putin's humiliation could be translated into a humiliation of the Russian people that they would feel change the political reality domestically on the ground, so that Putin would be able to engage in a national mobilization. So it's worth asking, if Ukrainian troops were, for instance, able to take the Crimea and occupy Yalta, would that change things domestically for Putin? Is that a humiliation that the Russian people might take onto themselves and be willing to go fight in Ukraine in a way they weren't before? So I'm not predicting that necessarily, but I think that's something we need to be considered, because right now so much of the decision making seems to exist around the assumption that Russia's capacity to fight this war is fixed and that Putin cannot expand the war. And that could potentially be a dangerous assumption depending on how successful Ukrainians are.
So very well noted. We're going to come back to that in a moment with a question from Silva, which I'll read, which is in chat. But first, Fritz, you have the floor.
Thank you for joining us today. I've heard you speak several times, and I'm going to pull two thoughts that I've heard from different talks you've given. And because I find it so interesting, you had pointed out that prior to the last election, 42% of US citizens didn't even realize that the US was fighting in Afghanistan. And I contrast that with where I've heard you talk about the most trusted institution in the United States is the US military. And yet, amazingly, people don't even realize the institution they trust is in a war. So I want to run, though, on the institutional angle, because you've talked about the importance of maintaining the US military as something that can be trusted, as an institution that can be trusted in the future. I know you've had advice and recommendations on that. I'd like to hear you expand on that, please.
Certainly. Well, I think, the U.S. although the U.S. military has been losing ground in polling recently with how it is trusted nationally as an institution, it is still one of the most trusted institutions in the United States. And I would argue that that is directly related to the fact that it is also one of the institutions that has probably the least overt political bias of any other institution in the United States, and that those two are correlated. But we have seen in this country the politicization of almost every facet of American life. The trend is not towards depoliticization of our lives, it's towards politicization. And we should be very concerned if that politicization infects the US military for obvious reasons, because service members have a political bias. I think the data that I've seen is that about 30% of Americans right now don't believe that Joe Biden is the duly elected president of the United States. So we should also assume that around 30% of people in uniform don't believe he is a legitimately elected president of the United States. Now, I don't say that to be alarming or provocative. I just state it as probably a fact. And it's important to recognize that when you wear the uniform, your relationship to the president is very different than that of a citizen. As a citizen, there you're a duly elected leader. When you wear the uniform, the president of the United States is the commander in chief. And to a significant degree, the legitimacy of many of the orders you receive is directly derived from the legitimacy of your chain of command. And that's the person who sits on the top of your chain of command. So you can imagine scenarios where if there is a vibrant, and I would say kinetic argument about the legitimacy of the president, that would turn into a vibrant and potentially kinetic argument within the military about the legitimacy of the orders that are coming from up and down the chain of command. That should concern us as citizens. The thing that I worry about is because we have this all volunteer military, and military service has frequently fallen onto sort of a subsection of our society, one of the results is that many citizens now are they're not fluent in military matters. So this type of a scenario just is not intuitive. They kind of don't recognize it, and that could surprise us societally, particularly as we careen from contested election to contested election. I would argue that since 2016, the result of president's elections have been contested. I'm not saying this is a partisan, but we've seen the escalation of contestation. So in 2016, there's contestation, 2020, there's even more. And if that pattern continues, we're probably going to see some fireworks in 2024. And the analogy I use is that every time we as a nation host a contested election, it's sort of like getting drunk at a bar. We go to the bar on election day, we get completely hammered drunk, and then we get in our car and we try to drive home. And so the last two times, we've managed to swerve our way home and park the car in the driveway, and we get out and we say, well, that was okay. We made it home. But with any drunk driver, usually the habit of driving drunk, the first or second time you do it, that's not when you wrap your car around the telephone pole. It's maybe the fourth or fifth time. And so if we keep engaging in this behavior, I fear it's a matter of time before we wrap our proverbial car around the telephone pole. And the U.S. military is obviously something we should be concerned about, not because I question the morality of people who wear the uniform. It's not that, but it's just because if we look from Caesar's Rome to Napoleon's France, anytime you couple a large standing military with incredibly dysfunctional politics at home, democracy doesn't last long. The founding fathers knew this, and it's something we should be paying very close attention to. But I feel we're not paying as close attention to it as we should, because there's just this massive disconnect between American civilians and those who wear the uniform because of the civil military divide that exists in this country.
So
Thank you.
Fritz, thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much. We're going to move ahead with 20 minutes and change left. I'm going to read something from Silva, something from David Morrison, then I'm going to give Jonathan Greenberg the floor. So if I get it wrong, jump in and correct me, but in short form, your question chat is about nuclear weapons, red lines like perhaps Crimea. What happens if the Putin regime feels itself humiliated? Might we expect an extremely dangerous scenario? Elliot?
Well, that's sort of the question that's been rankling everybody with regards to Ukraine and our strategic thinking around Ukraine. I don't know is the answer. I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to sit here and say I knew exactly what would happen if a nuclear weapon was used in Ukraine. With regards to Putin's decision making, I think that first of all, it's important to recognize that there are, a whole host of nuclear weapons. So if you use a nuclear weapon, it doesn't mean that you're using a doomsday weapon. He could use a relatively low-grade nuclear weapon. And then what follows, well, what's the point of doing that? And I would say the point of doing that would be for Putin to break the nuclear taboo. Because once the taboo is broken, we can imagine how we go up an escalatory ladder relatively quickly with regards to the use of nuclear weapons. The question becomes, what does Putin think he's going to gain by using a nuclear weapon? And this is where I start to sort of lose the thread a little bit, frankly, because if he were to use a tactical nuclear weapon inside of Ukraine, I have a hard time imagining any set of scenarios where the world just sort of throws up its arms and say, well, we can't do anything more in Ukraine. We need to walk away and just give Putin whatever he wants. I think you would see the opposite response from the world. I think Putin would probably pretty quickly find himself on his own, or at least more. He wouldn't find more people rallying to his cause. And I don't know where that increased isolation would get him. I do think there is a danger. Putin has very clearly from the outset played a game of using his nuclear capability as a tool to mitigate and limit a response from the outside. And I think we should also be equally cautious not to let the specter of him using a nuclear weapon lead to an even worse outcome than were he to use a minor nuclear weapon and try to take all of Ukraine. Well, listen, it's an issue that we have to be paying attention to. It's remarkable to be sitting here with nuclear weapons in play for a time they haven't been in place since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to be doing it in a world that's not a bipolar world, but it's a multipolar world and infinitely more complex. So I think we're right to be concerned about it.
So thank you very much. I'm going to now read David Morrison. David, if I get you wrong, correct me. In short form, David wants to know if we overestimate our influence and our ability, as he says, to compel liberal democratic government, including by force. He's following on from Dan Shiro and speaks to the issue of our goals and our expectations and our influence, real and limited. Elliot?
Well, I think that's right. I think that we have seen through Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan that it is very difficult to implement or even support democratic movements in a society where there isn't a consensus that democratic government is necessarily what they want. And when those societies have not worked out those issues for themselves, it's very difficult for us to necessarily be a successful partner to one side in that dispute. As opposed to, again, a place like Ukraine, where as much as that's a society that does have internal divisions, it's important to recognize that, or it's important to remember, that President Zelensky's approval was at about 35% before Russia invaded. So he was not a overwhelmingly popular leader, but there is a clear national consensus in a place like Ukraine. And so because that national consensus exists, our aid can go much further. But when there isn't a real consensus, yes, oftentimes it's very, very difficult for us to become an effective participant in those type of internecine conflicts. And Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam are proof of that.
So thank you both very much. And thank you, David Morse, for the question. Jonathan Greenberg, you have the floor, please.
Hello, Elliot. My main concern right now is that it appears that since August 21st, Afghanistan has now been in America's rearview mirror. And that greatly concerns me. I'm looking ahead to the future of that country and just have great concerns. And like you, I too have been bitten by the Afghan bug, as Khalid Hosseini put it, and one never gets over it. For me, 50 plus years ago, I served in the Peace Corps, living in Garmsir district in Helmand. And for the last 15 years, I've been working with an organization bringing Afghan girls, young women, to the United States to study. And obviously, in this last year, it's been just mind-boggling what we've had to deal with. My concern is, where is this country going to go at this point? And I get, just personalizing here, I get very upset, especially, I suppose, with the progressive movement, quote unquote, here, specifically the women who are so concerned with pronouns and so forth, and completely ignore the plight of 50% of the Afghan population and the women. Do we not have an obligation there from a humanitarian point of view? I know we've been focusing mainly on the military, and certainly your role there was exemplary. But I guess I'm just venting here, but it's so frustrating for me and the small nonprofit that I work with, trying to help the women there. And my last point, am I not correct that there has to be an indigenous movement within Afghanistan to make a change? And the only thing I'm seeing are coming from displays of women who've been protesting. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks for that, Jonathan. Candidly, I share your frustrations. I think that the way we as a country have behaved in Afghanistan is an indictment of us that will prove to be a strategic liability. I have been of a mind that we're at our strongest when we are wisely living our values on the world stage. So we shouldn't be reckless in living those values and get involved in adventures that have no real resolution. But on the other side, I think the type of precipitous withdrawal that we engaged in showed a hardness to the American, I would just say our collective sort of consciousness. It was very hard and unwavering. And I think that is going to come back and haunt us for some time. I think also moving forward, America might be done with Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is not done with the United States. However, the United States doesn't really have agency inside of Afghanistan anymore. So because we don't have any type of agency, we're just going to have to see what happens. I think it should be obviously very alarming that Ahmed Zawahiri was in Kabul. I mean, I think it was sort of remarkable that the administration touted that as some type of success, that they were able to kill him, when in fact, in my estimation, it proves the very failure that, immediately Al-Qaeda comes back into Afghanistan, and we're sort of back to conditions as they were before September 11th. With regards to, again, the plight of women in Afghanistan, I think it's very damning how we, the war was not about liberating Afghan women. That's not why we went to war in Afghanistan, but our willingness to sort of turn our back on our values and to people who purport to be on the side of women to also staunchly be on the side of abandoning Afghanistan is very difficult to explain to our allies, and shows a degree of American hypocrisy. So, as I mentioned at the front, I was an advocate for keeping troops there, supporting the Afghans in their fight. I think just even from a real politique level, it made more strategic sense for us But now we are in this position where the future of Afghanistan is not going to be determined by the United States, but I suspect we will have to deal with what that future is because it will involve us. But I share your frustration.
So if I may, I'm going to pose a follow-on question to you, Jonathan, and to Elliot about this very point, which is so important. How do we generate more attention and engagement and support for Afghan women? And how, if you accept the premise of my question, I'm going to ask you first, Jonathan, how do we do it in such a way that recognizes, in my view, that a number of, or perhaps many women of Afghanistan want a better life, reject Taliban rule, and all the barbarism that comes with that, but it's still a society that is traditional, tribal, conservative, and religious. We're not, in my view, we're not trying to get them to Santa Monica or Malibu in fall 2022. That's not quite it either. So how do you think about that, Jonathan? Then we'll give Elliot a chance to reply, and then we'll go to the next question. But how do you think about that, and how do you manage that conversation?
Yeah, I think a big frustration identifying with all those points you raised, and I think the one item you neglected to address is the patriarchy of that society. And that is one of the biggest frustrations. I mean, we're seeing, in fact, many of the young Afghan women that I've gotten to know, especially over this last year, have all stated that when they would speak out, their brothers, their fathers would condemn them for daring to bring dishonor to the family. This is the frustration. But on the other hand, there are many families now that are supportive of education. And another thing that upsets me, and I don't know how to address this, but we're hearing, my God, these young women now, they're going back to what they experienced years before. No, these young girls, 16, 17, 18 years old, they never experienced that. They grew up in a time when the US was supporting education, the girls were getting educated, and now this is just new territory for them. And I think what has to happen, it's got to come from the young men, and we are seeing that with their cohorts, male cohorts are starting to stand up for them here. And it's just frustrating. But I think we have to do something through some agencies. I know there are some human rights agencies there, certainly. But it's just baffling to me. Probably haven't addressed.
So look, that helps. Thank you for that, Elliot.
I would just briefly add too, Afghan culture is not a monolith. I mean, it is a culture consisting of many, many subcultures. So, the culture in Kabul with how, women have existed in Kabul the last 20 years is very different than the culture in Nuristan, in rural areas. And that having an Afghan government that is both, regionally adaptive, but also has certain baseline standards, like girls are allowed to receive an education, is important. But I don't think, I think that when we take away just the baseline rights, as you're seeing the Taliban do, that, that's when you run into real problems. And there is an argument that can be made that you can still have a conservative Afghan culture that is aligned with the longstanding values of Afghanistan, that isn't, as you said, Santa Monica, while also assuring sort of basic fundamental rights for women.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to now read Edward Murphy in chat. Edward, if I get it wrong, you'll correct me. Please feel free to do so. In essence, it's a counterfactual. You'll see it there, Elliot. If we had done as you had advocated and kept a minimal troop presence in Afghanistan, what would Afghanistan look like today? What would be the possibilities going forward if, at least in my words, we provided that overhead cost for some internal peace and security?
I would argue that Afghanistan would look a lot like Iraq. First of all, it's important to understand, like, the collapse of the Afghan government was not a fait accompli. And one of the essential and early betrayals of the Afghan government, which again mirrors what happened in Vietnam, was the Trump administration's decision to unilaterally negotiate with the Taliban. much like we unilaterally negotiated with the North Vietnamese at the end of that war. And that completely, and this is back in 2018, began the process of delegitimization of the Afghan government. And the Afghan government had problems before that. I'm not making any type of argument that it was a perfect government, but it's important to realize, at the peak of the surge, we had 150,000 troops, NATO and US in Afghanistan. We had already in 2018 completed a 90% withdrawal from Afghanistan. We had 15,000 troops there, no longer in an active combat mission, but in an advise and assist mission. So I would argue Afghanistan could have looked somewhat like Iraq, or even a more optimistic outlooks, because this was also a narco war, could have looked like Colombia. We have examples of success in this capacity. And again, yes, it takes a long time, but when we look at where the American electorate was in 2018, 42% of Americans don't even know this war is going on. So it's not like we're seeing a massive anti-war movement that's forcing the hand of our domestic politicians. As much as a withdrawal and a quote unquote end to the Afghan war becomes this essential issue, it's because it was an issue forced by the Trump administration and because the Biden administration decided to double down on the Trump administration's policies. So, my counterfactual would be, we didn't need to unilaterally negotiate with the Taliban. We could have continued supporting the Afghan military and kept our troop levels very low and kept them in a train and assist mission that would have had our casualties remain de minimis. And I also would just add, there's been this narrative too, that in some ways the Afghan government was illegitimate because it was supported by the US government, and that the Taliban was in some ways more legitimate. Now, I would just make sure to point out, the Taliban has throughout this war been supported by the Pakistani government. If the Pakistani government would have unilaterally withdrawn its support from the Taliban would have collapsed. So this is a war of proxy on both sides. The difference is the Pakistanis played it all the way through with the Taliban and we did not.
So here we are, colleagues, home stretch. Don Bishop, very likely the final question or comment. Don, good to see you. You have the floor.
You may not be able to see it on screen, but your talk has got me all in turmoil. I was a lieutenant in Vietnam. Later in the Foreign Service, I helped process Vietnamese refugees through Hong Kong. You fast forward more, and I was in Afghanistan in 09-10 at the embassy. And the impression I got certainly from Afghanistan, where I was at a higher perch, is there's a big disconnect between the war in Washington and the war in Afghanistan. People who were there, could see things, and people in Washington were, processing their view of the war through domestic politics. And it was particularly evident when the war tourists came. Congressional staffers, cabinet members, and so on. So I think all through American history, commanders have had to keep one eye on Washington and one eye on the theater. But I wonder if you have any views on this Washington theater disconnect as a sort of a consistent theme in America's overseas military.
I think it absolutely is a consistent theme because these are oftentimes wars of choice. And so they are subject to the vicissitudes of domestic politics. And, it doesn't surprise me that that was your response. When I was in Afghanistan, I very much sort of breathed some of those same winds. So yes, I agree. I would make one observation, Don, because you were in Vietnam. And maybe this is sort of adjacent to the point you were making. I fought in these wars, and obviously, Vietnam was my parents' war, but loomed very large when I was a young man, kind of coming into the service, because that was really America's last war. And over my time in service, I got to know many Vietnam veterans, and many were very generous as mentors to me. But to be candid, I always felt there was sort of this little bit of distance that existed between the Iraq, Afghanistan veterans and the Vietnam veterans. Please don't take this the wrong way. I always felt that the Vietnam guys sort of looked at us askance for two reasons. I think they were skeptical of the fact that we kept volunteering to go back to the wars from doing all of these tours over many, many years because we were volunteers. And they thought something was wrong with us. And that they And when I looked at them, I always felt that they were more disillusioned than they were. And I had rationalized that as saying, well, they're more disillusioned because they were children of the 1950s and they had sort of further to go. And, we weren't as, we grew up in a kind of an edgier time. So we didn't have as much distance to go to become disillusioned. And I always believed that for a long time. That was sort of just a little distance I felt between me and the Vietnam guys. And I write about this a little bit in the book. In August of 2021, I realized that I was totally wrong, that was not what was going on, that the distance I experienced from the Vietnam guys was actually something entirely different. Was the Vietnam guys knew how this ended and we didn't. And even though we've been fighting for a really, really long time, they knew the final thing that was going to happen. It was sort of like they didn't have the heart to tell us. And it was candidly this type of a betrayal, this type of the war ends with this complete debacle and people in Washington just want to wash their hands of it and you're going to be left holding the bag. And if I ever felt like they were sort of, patting us on the head and being like, kid, you're not quite there yet, it was because they knew how it was going to end. And so I just bring that up in that context. And I have felt sort of more of a kin with the Vietnam folks after August of 2021 than I ever felt before.
So Don, thank you very much. Elliot, thank you. And colleagues, that brings us to the end of the program. Thank you all for your valuable time. If you're in a position to do so, switch your camera on just so we can greet and wish everybody a good day and evening. We have people from different countries and different parts of the United States. Elliot, thank you for your writing. Thank you for your service, for the time today. And for this, your latest book, I'll hold it up. I hope you can see it, The Fifth Act, America's in Afghanistan. I found the book, Elliot, just like the conversation today, inspiring, but also it makes one pensive. And so you provoke our thoughts. Thank you very much, Elliot. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone for being on the call and the conversation.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.